Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the chemistry department, let me welcome you to this celebration of the 90th birthday year of our very own Emeritus Professor of Chemistry, Carl Djerassi. Now, some of you may know that Carl's birthday was actually last October, but Carl's schedule is so busy with so many worldwide engagements that this is the first time that we could properly hold this event here. So we have two goals this afternoon. First of all, as you may know, Carl has had a truly distinguished career as a world-renowned synthetic and physical organic chemist. And his scientific accomplishments will be summarized in a moment by our own Richard Zare, the Marguerite Blake Wilbur Professor in Natural Science and Professor by courtesy of Physics. Second, for the past 25 years, Carl has pioneered a new area beyond chemistry. He has become a prolific author of numerous literary and dramatic works of art exploring scientists and scientific themes, often termed science in art or sci-art. There's no one in the world more qualified than Carl himself to describe his work in this area, which will form the bulk of our program. Before we begin, I would like to thank Ed, Karen, and Patricia Dwyer for extensive efforts behind the scenes to make today's event possible. And I want to say that at the end of the afternoon, please join us to continue discussion with Carl with food and drink upstairs in the Nexus cafeteria. So now let me call Professor Zare to introduce Carl's accomplishments in chemistry.
I'm delighted to get a chance to induce you. Great. You know, our nonagenarian, right? What a wonderful reason to have a party. And we're going to have a party this afternoon. I'm looking forward to it very much. As a chemist, Djerassi is known for his introduction of physical methods in organic chemistry. And, well, something else, too. Let's see. Creative synthesis of a variety of substances with biological activity and societal impact. In one case, with overwhelmingly huge societal impact. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay? Competing with the top chemical synthesis groups in the world, he and his colleagues at a small laboratory in Mexico, okay, that later became the giant Syntex, okay, beat them to the synthesis of the all-important molecule cortisone. He continued at Syntex to make a variety of steroids, including norethindrone, which is today a component of pharmaceuticals that control fertility. Djerassi's chemistry contributed critically to what is perhaps one of the greatest liberations of all time, the freedom of a woman to make a choice on contraception. Djerassi likes to call himself the father of the pill, but because society has very ambivalent attitudes towards sexuality and contraception, this achievement has not garnered him the recognition he deserves. Let me share with you some of his scientific achievements involving the synthesis of medicinally important steroids. Okay? These are going to be a few selected publications. Let me get out a pointer. Okay, buried here. Okay. So, in the late 1940s and throughout the 50s, Djerassi made major contributions to the synthesis of medicinally important steroids. Like what? Okay. Well, here's a reference to the paper. I thought I'd give you that so you can read it. And this thing is one of the first partial syntheses of the natural estrogens, subsequently used commercially, back 1950, okay? And this paper here, synthesis of cortisone in 51, okay? The first synthesis of cortisone from a plant raw material, okay? Next we get to this work, steroidal saponogenins, okay? Conversion to cortisone. What's this one about? This is the first synthesis of cortisone from hecogenin, the sisal waste, which became the basis of an industrial process used for many years by Glaxo to manufacture cortisone. And here's yet another paper. This is the synthesis of 19-norprogesterone. The compound was then the most potent synthetic progesteronal agent, which provided the key lead to the first synthesis of a 19-norsteroid oral contraceptive, this norethindrone that I mentioned before in 51, and to all subsequent 19-norsteroids used in contraception. Okay, here's another paper. This is the synthesis of, I may not say it right, Sinalar, the most potent topical corticosteroid known at the time, whose introduction for the treatment of psoriasis and inflammatory conditions was largely responsible for the wide use of topical corticosteroids in medical practice. Getting a sense of this person? Yeah. Okay. During the 1950s and 60s, Djerassi conducted extensive research on the structural elucidation of antibiotics. His group was the very first to elucidate the structure of a macrolide antibiotic. This group contains many clinically important compounds such as erythromycin. Okay? These are things I hope you've heard of. Okay? Djerassi devoted a major part of his scientific career to the application of physical methods to the structure elucidation of organic molecules. As somebody who's looked at these things, people use them and they forget where they come from. In fact, this is generally what happens when you develop a method. If it's really successful, it's forgotten where it's from. And thanks in these conditions are rare. Very few people today are giving thanks to Euclid and Gauss for what we do in mathematics, etc. Okay. He pioneered the use of optical rotatory dispersion and circular dichroism in organic chemistry through research spanning 3 decades in the mid-1980s. There's just many, many papers. And I've started to mention some of these here that you can take a look at, all involving chirality, handedness. He then moved on to the study of magnetically induced optical activity, magnetic circular dichroism. And instead of having to be naturally a hand, a left hand versus a right hand, now with the magnetic field, you could make anything into a hand. Okay, so this is really neat. Doesn't require intrinsic chirality. And here are some things involving this. Okay? Djerassi's group, along with Klaus Biemann's and Fred McLafferty's, brought mass spectrometry to organic chemistry in the early 1960s. Okay? And over a period of 30 years, Djerassi's group introduced mechanistic interpretations of mass spectra that enormously expanded the use of the technique in structure elucidation. Here's, again, just a few of the papers involved in doing this. In the 1960s, in a series of investigations, okay, initially in collaboration with professors Josh Lederberg and Ed Feigenbaum of Stanford University. Is Ed here? Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ed. Okay, his group was the first to carry out research on applications of computer-aided artificial intelligence techniques to chemical structure elucidation. Way ahead of their time, way ahead, okay? And this is, I just wanted to say the words dendril, because you'll see those words again in Stanford's history, very much, the Dendril Project. In '72, Djerassi initiated his, I think, last major research project, which was concerned with the structure, elucidation, biosynthesis, and possible biological function of marine natural products, all types of sponges and such. This work involved the isolation and structure determination of around 150 marine sterols. Wow, I mean, staggering. Hope you get us. And I'm not putting them all up because you know that would be the end of the time here. We started to start this. Can't do it. And I thought now what I'd do is I'd switch to something else, okay? With over 100 publications, Djerassi's contributions to chemistry have been, well, monumental. But so far, this recitation of his achievements failed to capture the complex individual we celebrate today. A person who was able at the same year to receive from President Nixon the National Medal of Science and to be named on Nixon's blacklist. Now that is an achievement. As chair of this department, I helped to organize an ACS symposium celebrating Carl's achievements in San Francisco in 2006. And this is one picture from this event. My lovely wife, Susan, who's in the audience here, and Carl, as you see, and I'm wearing a button. This button, if you look at it carefully, is from supporting the election of Bassem Shakashiri, which would be successful to become the new ACS president. And what's this in the background? Where are we? We are at SF MoMA, okay, the Museum of Modern Art. And this is Djerassi's Paul Klee collection, which he has donated to SF MoMA. And over 140 pieces. I don't remember the exact number, but an incredible collection. I urge you all, if you get a chance in San Francisco, if you haven't seen it, go see it. It is fabulous, okay? Very interesting. Here's another picture of some of his friends who were at this event. And some you'll recognize, like Roald Hoffman. Others you won't immediately recognize, but that's actually Hans Andersen, okay, peeking out, and so forth. Okay, lots of people this time. Very happy occasion that we had here. Okay. Of course, it was Roald Hoffman who, with Carl Djerassi, would write this wonderful play, Oxygen, which we may hear more about later. Okay? Most successful. Well, after retiring from the Stanford Chemistry Department in 2002, Carl Djerassi has devoted himself to expressing science to the general public in artistic forms, including drama, fiction, and poetry. And he has done so with immense personal energy and with huge success. Now, actually, he had started on this theme before 2002, and it only accelerated since then. And when I mean, this guy's prolific, let me try to explain what I mean by this. This is taken from his website. These are, by and large, mostly books that he has authored, and you'll hear more about some of these. There's plays as well as poetry and other things. There's so much here. Wow. Wow. This is, what do people do? Okay. On the nonfiction side, I point to Djerassi's autobiographical works. Incidentally, he has 3 of them. Really so. For example, in 2000, Stephen Jay Gould said, quote, "He's a scientist, artist, philosopher, and mensch, all in one," unquote, and declared that Djerassi's book, The Pill, Pygmy Chimps, and Degas Horse, quote, "is the very best scientific autobiography," unquote. Djerassi's This Man's Pill, Reflections on the 50th Birthday of Pill, is a powerful display of scientific authority, personal conviction, emotional struggle with success and with pain, and a model for the communication of science to general audiences. In Chapter 9, entitled The Softer Chemist, Djerassi expands on several societal issues, particularly those relating science, ethics, and mentoring. He describes how he guided Stanford graduate students and postdocs enrolled in one of his classes to write a science renga that was published in Nature in '98. Now, I have to confess to you, I'm not that learned a person. I didn't even know what a renga was, okay, at all until I started reading about this. And a renga is a form of a Japanese collaborative poetry, which in Western literature is an alternating a creative creation as you put it together. This work is probably the first known piece of fiction published in a leading scientific journal, and it clearly demonstrates the complexity of dealing with personal and societal issues, even at an elite institution of higher education. He goes on and continues teaching, and he's teaching again this year, as you, I hope, will hear about. By example, Djerassi has pointed a way for fellow scientists to expand the professional development of their students. This work seems to be the forerunner of a new literary genre that Djerassi has introduced, which he calls science in fiction. Not science fiction, science in fiction. Okay, Djerassi's goal is to demystify science, making it more accessible to the general public by depicting scientists in fiction or plays as fully developed characters with the same motivations and the same faults as everyone else. In his literary work, Djerassi explores the mores of science, the creative essentiality of competition, the id and the ego in creation, and what happens to women in this scientific world. Djerassi humanizes science, and in doing so, he reaches out far beyond our own field to our friends in the arts and humanities and to everyone. As a colleague, he has done more for the Stanford Chemistry Department than most others, certainly more than the chair who gave him such a bad time. For example, he created our Industrial Affiliates program that served as a model for effective university-industry partnerships. He was responsible for why we have what we call the Chemistry Department gazebo. Okay? There's also a Chemical Engineering gazebo, same style, which was his brainstorm. Because of petty jealousies and his own nature, which at times can be, shall we say, quite assertive, okay? I do not think that my department has always treated Carl as he deserves, but there are many of us who regard Carl Djerassi as one of the greatest chemists ever associated with our department. He is truly an amazing individual, as you will discover. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Carl Djerassi.
There are 4 seats here, and I think the 4 oldest people there, or the 4 youngest, should come here and sit here. I will. I'll move back in a moment, but I'll first wander around. I just want to make a couple of remarks. I'm wearing a tie. I think there are only 3 people here in the audience who are wearing ties. I usually do not appear with ties, but I want to show how seriously I'm taking today. I give sort of hundreds of lectures, particularly in the last few years in my new life. I haven't given any at Stanford in the last 20 years, so therefore, if I'm going to do it every 20 years, I thought I'd wear a tie today. The next one then would be at my 110th birthday, when I suspect most of you won't be here, but I plan to be here. And I'll probably wear the same tie. But what I plan to do today is to make up for the fact that you haven't heard from me for 20 years. So I'm going to try and cover an awful lot of new territory, new to you, very quickly. But as the title of the talk implied, talk about my last 25 years, which were totally different from the preceding ones. And when did the preceding ones start? I graduated rather early from college, from Kenyon College in Ohio. And at age 19, I needed money. I couldn't afford to go to graduate school at that point. I worked for a pharmaceutical company for 1 year, Ciba in New Jersey, which is now part of Novartis. And I had the good luck to be associated with the discovery of one of the first 2 antihistamines, pyribenzamin, in that 1 year. So that was the first patent on which my name appeared in the first publication. And that, I think, influenced me enormously because I thought I probably wanted to go to medical school and then instead started to go to chemistry. And then I really was in chemistry for 50 years. And I won't talk about chemistry. The professors there tried to do this, although it's a pathetic attempt, you know, to talk about 50 years in 10 minutes. You actually used 5 extra minutes of mine, which I plan to collect afterwards. I can tell you. I mean, by stay, you have to stay longer for 5 minutes, and if so, it's his fault and not mine. You know, just to make that plain. But after 50 years, I decided, and I will tell you why and how and what I did, to change my life entirely. And there were 2 different reasons. One is the official reason, and it's partly true, that I wanted to lead a different intellectual life after 50 years of chemistry. I was a workaholic chemist like all the others, and I felt that was enough. I published too many papers, well over 1,000 papers, and I wanted to do something else. But that sounds too intelligent and too correct, and as usual, autobiographical statements, and that is one, are usually auto-mythology. They are not the real truth. And the real truth I'll tell you in a moment. But what I first want to show you in terms of slides, that supposedly, and I already made a mistake in this otherwise extremely well-organized thing, you are being bribed through the generosity of our present chair, Professor Murner, with 120 books of mine, that is 10 books each of 12 books that I've written. Actually, I've written during that period of time about 24 books. But I picked the 12 that I thought would really tell you something about me. Not about what I did, but about me, because there's no question that there's really been an ongoing conversation with myself in the guise of fiction, where I could address subjects in science and outside of science, which I would be either embarrassed or ashamed or afraid to discuss in an autobiography, and I've done it there. But the idea was that you would get this at the end and not at the beginning, the books, for two reasons. First of all, to make you stay here and not walk out in the middle, which was a pure bribery. But the other one, because I want to tell you something about the books so you can make an intelligent choice. But I observed what you're doing outside. You did exactly what I was afraid of. Namely, you picked the most obvious and easier thing to read. So the first thing that disappeared was a collection of short stories. You're making a mistake, as you will learn now. And I encourage those of you who grab the short story, try and sell it now to someone else and trade something. But we'll talk about that later. So let me tell you first, very quickly, what we're going to cover. There are 12 books that you're getting. And is there a pointer here? Yeah. So you're getting 12 books. First of all, I wrote a tetralogy, 4 volumes of science and fiction. These are the first 3. I'll tell you something about them in a moment. And then here's the 4th one called NO. Then a collection of poetry and short stories. These are 2 books that only came out last year. And you'll see in a moment why I'm including these. And then here 3 plays. My first play, my third play, Calculus, and my very last play, Foreplay. And I will end with that, and you'll see why I'm doing that. And then finally, the best book I've ever written, 4 Jews and Parnassus. And I noticed that no one picked that up there, because that's a sort of title that would not necessarily be easy reading, but I can tell you I made a mistake. I've never written anything that's sophisticated and as intelligent and as good as this, I never will again. And then 3 other plays. 4 other plays. There are 2 plays in this book under the topic of, you can see it here, and then 2 that deal with chemistry and science, namely fallacy and insufficiency. And again, I'll be talking briefly about this. You're going to see a few excerpts of plays, so it won't always talk mine. You'll hear even possibly a little bit of music and some other things which will, partly I want to impress you. I want to impress you, the range of things I've done, but in part also to amuse you. So let's start where it started all. I closed my lab in 1992. I told you I started research in 1942. I closed my lab here at Stanford in 1992 and became emeritus in 2002. I still teach in the winter quarter, but certainly not chemistry. This was, in a way, the first book that was not really for a general audience, but it was different from the things that I'd written before. I'd written a number of books, but they were chemical monographs. And there was an autobiography, a chemical autobiography, unreadable for a general public because it was full of the pictography of chemical structures, and it was written for chemists as part of an ACS series. So, but I started there, and that got me into an autobiographical mode, and that led to my second and real autobiography, which is now out of print, but it is one that is a real autobiography, and I think it's a pretty sophisticated book, with which I'm really pleased. But I made a following statement there. Namely, that autobiography, in contrast to biography, must be a form of fiction. You cannot change it. It has to, because you talk about yourself through your own psychological filter. And that filter will try to eliminate the worst aspects of your behavior, point number 1, whether you know it or not, because you're starting to undress yourself in public. And most people are not utter masochists. They like to go and show their attractive muscles rather than, I don't know, their stomach or something like this, metaphorically speaking. And furthermore, you write autobiographies at an advanced age. I wrote this in my middle, late 60s. And you start, of course, talking about earlier things which you've regretted partly, or you remembered it a certain way, and then, of course, you wish it had happened another way, or you start convincing itself would happen another way. And you think about it long enough, and pretty soon you believe it. And you actually tell these stories. And my graduate students and postdoctorates, I know that, also do exactly the same thing. You know, at my age, I meet people who were postdocs of mine 50 years ago. They all look like old men. Very few of them were women at that point. And these old men come to me and tell me, do you remember this and that? And I know that it's baloney. But, you know, I say, oh, yes, it sounds very nice. And, you know, we both really rehash something that really, in fact, never happened. or it didn't quite happen that way. And that's an important point. That's not actually a joke. It is really true. Very different from biography, where, of course, someone writes about another person. But I became conscious of this. And the interesting part is that I wrote another autobiography, this is where I'm talking about the others, which came out last year, but which none of you will have read yet, although it has come out, because it's written it was wrote in English, but it came out in German. It's called Der Schattensammler. The English translation, I read in English, not in German, it was translated, although I speak fluent German, is Treading on Shadows. And it says here, the very last autobiography of Carl Djerassi. But in fact, what it really is an autopsychoanalysis. And something completely differently written from the other autobiographies, because, first of all, why do I talk about shadows? Because I want to talk about the shadows in my life, the shadows in the context, the gray aspects of how I behaved, how I wish I would, if I could relive my life again, how I would change it. And I'm very open. At my age, I can literally strip, because it doesn't make any difference anymore. And it wouldn't be things that I would have kept hidden. When that comes out, there's quite a bit about Stanford, and some of it is very nice, and some of it is not so nice. And it's all there in black and white. But the important point is that this is not an autobiography written chronologically, but thematically, just about certain themes. As what I try to do as a professor, what I try to do as a writer, as homelessness, which is a very important aspect of me, because in case you don't know, you know it's there. I was a refugee from Nazi Hitler days, and I think I've been traumatized sufficiently that I probably never felt at home in any place, which is the reason why I commute between three places: San Francisco, London, and Vienna. So I have homes, but not necessarily the German word for Heimat, which is something very different from home. So it's an introduction. So what I plan to do today is to explain to you how I went from autobiography, a form of fiction, as I just told you, to real fiction, which I call science in fiction, and which in fact is exactly the opposite. Because everything I describe there, and I will try and demonstrate to you, is true, has happened, unvarnished. Because you can do it there. I can claim it's in the guise of fiction. I put myself in the many different figures in my fiction, including many of the women. And I don't give you my Rosetta Stone, so you do not know which portion of me is in whose character. But there I tell the unvarnished truth, and it is worthwhile actually paying attention to that. And then why I moved to playwriting at age 75, which has really been my occupation for the last 15 years. And it's been a productive one, because we scientists, and I'm still a scientist in spite of the fact that I left the field 25 years ago, are not permitted, nor do we permit ourselves, to use dialogue in our written discourse. Go try and write the best paper you've ever written on single molecule, whatever you want to, and try and do it in dramatic form, so it'll take less space than the usual journal article. Well, you know perfectly well the journal is going to reject it, absolutely, and you don't have the guts to do it that way. So therefore, I like dialogue, and I decided to use the one form of dialogue which is permitted these days, which is, of course, the theater. But there are other reasons why I want to use theater, and I will try and demonstrate that to you. So we'll go with this. Let us start now with the beginning. So, how did I really start moving? Was it really that I wanted to lead another intellectual life? That would be a lie if I really claimed that entirely, because that was 1985. But in 1983, May 8, 1983, you see, I still remember the day, the great love of my life left me. I had already been married twice before. I was divorced, and I met, but in the end turned out to be the most fabulous woman of my life. And we lived together, more or less together, for about 4.5 years. She was a professor here at Stanford, not in the sciences, and then was on sabbatical leave at Harvard at the Bunting Institute. And we then used to meet during that year, always in New York. And one of our meetings, she told me, it was gently told, but I looked at it as utterly brutal, that she didn't fall in love with someone else, and we're through. That was it. And, I was a typical male, arrogant, conceited male who said, my God, she has me, how can she fall in love with someone else? on any of the parameters that you use for falling in love with someone. Well, that's lover, affluence, intelligence, humor, you name it. I mean, I thought about the cat's meow, and of course she could not possibly fall in love with someone else, and I was absolutely outraged. I was outraged, but there was nothing to talk about. We were finished. And when I returned to Stanford from New York after hearing that here, in addition to secreting enormous amounts of adrenaline and corticosteroids and everything else, I started what probably would be writing a diary in poetic form. I'd never written a poem in my life before. There was an explosion of poems, about 40, 50, 60, which I wrote in just a few months. I'll read you one, and I'll project it, but read it with me so that you don't go ahead of it here. It's called Private Revenge with a Public Touch. When cheated privately, one wants private revenge. When cheated publicly, one wants public revenge. The logic is impeccable, the subtly open to question. I was cheated privately, primarily through absence of words. I was cheated publicly, primarily through distance. Here's my revenge, primarily private, but with a public touch. I shall write you poems, public poems for all to read, where the private meaning is a lock to which only you can carry the key. If keys can be bitter, let this one be one. Let this be one. Well, that's pretty brutal stuff. And I came to recognize it, of course, only somewhat later on. And I want to say that, no, I will go back. I don't want to do it then. After writing these poems, I thought it was not enough. I now write a novel. I'll show I can also write novels. And I wrote a novel about this fantastic professor, male professor, and this fantastic female professor who had made one mistake. She fell in love with someone else. And, it was a fictionalized account of how I visualized the collapse of our relationship. And then, exactly 1 year later, May 8, 1984, which incidentally was one of the worst years of my life because I had a horrible accident also with my stiff leg, and I was in a cast for 8 months. I got a letter and flowers from that lady saying, we broke off a year ago. I wanted to correct her and say, you broke off, not we, but it didn't make any difference. Our relationship broke off. Would you like to talk about it? Well, of course, I wanted to talk about it the entire year. I didn't know really why it happened. But instead of sending her flowers back, which is what I should have done, again, with my, still tasting revenge, I sent her the novel. And when we met, the first question was not, it's wonderful to see you again. It was, what are you going to do with this? That's what she asked me. Well, I gave her a chemist's answer. If it's worth doing, it's worth publishing. So I decided to, I said, I'm going to look for a publisher. He said, you're mad. You're undressing us both. You can't do that. I said, undressing it. The man in the fiction, I have a stiff left leg, as you know this. Well, the man in there had a stiff right leg. So you see, it was fiction. So it was as subtle as all that. But it brought us together again. And we decided to get married. And when we got married, my wife-to-be asked me to promise never to publish that novel, and I never did. In fact, I never even read it again. I did not promise not to cannibalize it, and I have cannibalized it, especially in an important play of mine, perhaps the most successful play commercially that I've written, called, not surprisingly, Ego. EGO. Now, that wife of mine, Diane Middlebrook, one of the best English professors here at Stanford, we were married for 21 years until she died 6 years ago. And she was 16 years younger than I, so I never expected to survive her. These poems, these brutal poems of revenge, were not hidden, but I kept them somewhere. I didn't read them again. And then I accidentally read them 2.5 years ago. And I decided to publish them. The majority of them my wife had never seen. In fact, no one had read them. And I published them for reasons that are said right here. Because they're a tale of conceit and failure, of love and sadness, the curative power of time elapsed 30 years. And on the inside, I finally recognized in the old Latin proverb, revenge is but a confession of pain. And I thought it was worthwhile publishing this. I never told my stepdaughter about it because I thought she would be bothered about it until after the book came out. I wanted it to be irrevocable. And she is now also professor of comparative literature, and she was very pleased about it, which pleased me very much. And it is the only bilingual book that I've ever published. One page is German, the other one is English. And these are interesting poems, and therefore there are 10 copies out there, and I suspect that when the students walked by and picked it, no one picked that one, because people usually do not read poetry. They're making a mistake. And I encourage you that of the 10 who might be lucky enough to get a copy, at least 2 of you pick it, and then tell your fellows that they may have been wrong in their choice of just picking short stories. I'll get to the short stories in a moment. But I want to tell you that these revenge poems are not just all revenge. Some of them are extremely self-critical of me, because they were diaries, and diaries are written for oneself, not for others. So I did criticize myself in there in a way that I might not otherwise have done if I'd intended at that time to publish it. But I told you they were not intended for that. And so I think they are interesting insight into my persona. But I want to show you that I also wrote about chemists in there. And this is just an excerpt from one, Why Are Chemists Not Poets? Take a chemist. By definition, synthesizer of molecules, manipulators of molecules. For molecules, read words. You have defined the poet. Why then are chemists seldom poets? Chemists peer through safety glasses, working in fume hoods, behind explosion-proof shields, in a partial vacuum on an inert atmosphere. Can you imagine a poet writing in such a verse laboratory, writing sterile, non-explosive, non-inflammable, vacuous poems? Poems which, if they stink, are kept in a rarefied atmosphere to hide the stench? Now you know why there's no future for a careless chemist, a cautious poet. And there are quite a few other things that deal with chemists in these poems, which I think might interest the chemists in the audience. I apologize for drinking occasionally, but I might as well tell you I was diagnosed with a lousy form of cancer of my tongue, which I associate with too much talking and too much kissing. And both of them were worth the price. And I've had a tough radiation treatment last year here, which solves the problem more or less, except giving me a very dry mouth. So I have to drink occasionally. Now, my wife, Diane Middlebrook, a very sophisticated writer, an extremely successful biographer, and a superb critic, who never mixed the roles of critic and loving wife. So she was a very tough critic, said, you know, you do have, I don't know whether you have talent, but you have the discipline for writing. You know, it's amazing. I wrote a novel at a time when I didn't write it, when I had a very large research group. I taught, I did travel and so on. I wrote it on airplanes, in hotels, and especially at chemistry seminars. And you may wonder why, because I usually never take any notes at chemistry seminars. You know, I look at the slides, and, you know, people say slide, and then you can show in, you know, 1 picosecond, you can look at the structures, but the person talks for 5 minutes on these structures. So I suddenly kept writing notes, and people thought, oh my God, Djerassi's suddenly paying attention, or he's writing notes in seminar. In fact, what I was doing, I was writing a novel. And I never admitted that to people, but I managed in that airplane and seminar style to actually finish that novel. But she said, you have the discipline to do this. If you really want to become a writer, try short stories first, which is the advice one gives in any creative writing process. And at that time, shortly after we got married, I was diagnosed with real cancer. That was very severe colon cancer. I was in the hospital for a month. And for the first time in my life, I faced mortality. I never thought about death before. I was very healthy, and I was just 62. I was very depressed during that time before I knew what the prognosis was. As you can see, I obviously overcame this. But, and I thought, if I'd known that 5 years ago, would I have changed my life? And my answer to myself was yes, of course. And what would I have done? Another intellectual life. I was tempted about that once, years earlier. Actually, I wanted to become a cello player, just to give an idea. It was something very, very different. And I said, but now you know it, why don't you do it? And the only person whom I spoke about this was my wife, and I said, I will do this, and she said, do that. Of course, I couldn't tell it to anyone, certainly not to my students, because you don't close a lab from one day to another. You couldn't do that. And I had a large research group. So it took 5 years for tuition. I didn't take any more graduate students. I did take postdocs, and I continued to do chemical research, but my teaching started to shift very much at Stanford, in feminist studies, biomedical ethics, and so on. But the chemist, I remained a chemist. So I started short stories. And the year after that, my wife became the director of the Stanford program at Oxford, and I accompanied her in a very unusual way as a faculty husband for the first time in my life. So I went buying the groceries and so on while she was teaching, and I was writing all day long. And during that summer, I wrote a collection of short stories, and it was my first book. Never published in the United States. It was published in England, and then under slightly different titles because I added another short story, Coca-Cola, in German, in Spanish, in Italian, in Japanese, in Chinese, in a few languages, never in the United States. And the University of Wisconsin Press, at my real 90th birthday, it's a university, it was my alma mater, brought this book out there. And I know this. Most of the lazy graduate students, lazy because they think it's easy reading, pick that one. But actually it is an amusing book. And there is, I won't read you anything about this here, but just tell you about the table of contents and title of the short stories. Well, it turns out that the first three are entirely chemical ones. So it deal really with chemistry. In this one I mentioned Coca-Cola. You have something about Professor Brauman, whom I describe complimentarily under his own name there, so I've now made him immortal. But there are two short stories, Sleight of Mind and Toyota Cantos. That one, incidentally, is my favorite one at the bottom, where I talk about a man named Koji Nishinaka, who in fact is my closest Japanese friend, Koji Nakanishi, who is professor at Columbia University. And Lionel Trippett, an Italian professor on the bottom, is really based on something of Gilbert Storks, who's my oldest friend, the very famous synthetic organic chemist at emeritus at Columbia University. We won't have the time. I will skip what I otherwise would have read to you from there, namely how the story starts, but you can read this yourself if you are interested. And now let's get to the novels. I'm just looking at the pictures here, yes. So the first one is Cantor's Dilemma. That was my first novel. It turns out to be the most successful one. It is still in print, actually so are all the others. And it is in print in this form in which you see it outside, as a Penguin paperback. And this came out in 1991, 1992. It's now in its something like 29th print run. It gets reprinted at least once a year, not because it's a bestseller, but because it's a long seller. And it's used in many colleges, universities, it's been translated to a dozen languages or so, and tells you something that is particularly important for, I think, young scientists, people who are about to go to science, for the simple reason that it will really tell you something about science that you don't usually learn. Colleagues of mine have accused me, in part correctly so, although I don't plead guilty, I agree, that I was washing dirty lab coats in public. But I was doing that on purpose because they're also my lab coats. It's not that I accuse someone else. This is a collective mea culpa. If it is all a mea culpa. And if one works in a white lab coat, you're bound to get dirty. You don't have to be ashamed about this, but you should know that you're dirty. And you put in the laundry and you do something about it. If you get so filthy that you can't go and wash out the dirt, then you've got a problem. And you should know about that problem. And you should understand these problems ahead of time, because we do not learn how to become a scientist by reading books about it, by hearing lectures. I doubt whether you've ever gone to a lecture here at Stanford in chemistry that tells you how to be a scientist. You become that through a form of intellectual osmosis, through a mentor-disciple relationship or the relationship with your colleagues, and after a few years, you all behave the same way in certain respects, which are both good respects and bad respects, and I'm writing about both of them in this case. And the important point to just show you how widely it's been, this is the British publication on the right, then, I'm sorry, you can see here is a Spanish one, French one, the German one. That's a particularly amusing one because it's about a tainted Nobel Prize, which both the professor and the graduate student, the postdoc get. And you see here the professor at the Nobel Prize ceremony has a red diploma. It's a professor riding on the shoulders of the student, which I think is a rather good then you have Japanese, you have Bulgarian, you have Portuguese. So it's, as you can see, it's been published in many places. And the interesting part is that the covers are so very, very different in what people see as the main message. The important thing, the key thing of that novel is trust. And this is the epigraph. And that already tells you something that we don't think about, what's different about science compared to other creative arts. Trust is indispensable because science is vertical and we're completely dependent on our predecessors, while this is not necessarily the case in the other creative arts, in writing and music and painting and so on here. What I cover in that novel are the things that you have in bold here. Things that, for instance, my wife, an English professor, was simply not aware of them. For her, this was completely new, and she encouraged me to write it because she said, you're writing as an insider for a niche market. You know, science in fiction, there's one such novel for every 1,000 science fiction ones. But you're writing as a cognoscente. You really know what you're talking about. Stick to that. And to the right, and the next 3 novels fell into the same category. And I wanted to emphasize things that are distinct about our tribal behavior, the scientist tribal behavior. And these are, for instance, the question of publications. You know, we publish completely different from others. The priorities, you want to be first, the order of the authors, choice of the journal, whether it's going to be Nature or, you know, the Journal of the Podang Chemical Society. And then the most interesting thing, the brutal competition, at the same time the extraordinary collegiality, which very few places that you have that. And then, you know, the other things that I've mentioned here. So in other words, I'm writing primarily in virtually everything I do about how we do things rather than what we do. Because there are science journalists, there are other publications, Scientific American and so on, where you really can find this out quite readily. I want to show you chemists who appear by name in Cantor's Dilemma. So to show you really, I'm talking about real science. Jeremiah Cornell, Nakanishi and Stork from Columbia, Jacqueline Barton, Jack Roberts, Harry Gray from Caltech, late Conrad Bloch from Harvard, Corey from Harvard, Kishi from Harvard, George Whitesides from Harvard. And you see the sort of things I say. This came up during an interview trip, for instance. The female character, my main characters are always females, I might tell you. And that is partly involved with the fact that I did teach for many years in our feminist studies program here. And because my wife, my late wife, was at one time the chair of the feminist studies program. So if I needed to learn any feminism, I don't think I needed to, but if I did, I learned it in bed, which is probably the most effective place to learn this. But you see, first what I say about Whitesides. The woman came to Harvard as an interview trip and then reports to her fiancé about it. Says, you know, I was warned about Whitesides, and plenty of people are warned about Whitesides, but it was particularly nice. So you see, I don't insult the people that I have in my novel. I think Howard McConnell from Stanford, I don't think that to this day he knows that he actually was in one of my novels, just as Dan Brauman did not know that it's one of my short stories. Give you an example of how I'm dealing with this, a topic that should interest you and that we never discuss. This is a discussion between a woman professor, roughly the age of, let's say, Professor Zagelsky in this department, but named Jean. And it's a discussion with a graduate student in the humanities and the chemistry professor's graduate student. And the humanities student says, Jean, when dealing with the question of senior authorship, and why you thought it appropriate for a chemistry professor to add her name to a paper, you always said we. Now, why do I say that? You know, in English, no English professor would ever put his or her name on the PhD thesis of an English student. We in chemistry do it all the time, or most of the time, so that was the debate here. And the professor said, what should I have said? She said, what's wrong with the first person singular? I, rather than we. And the professor said, but we're taught never to do that in a scientific paper talk, even in the absence of any co-workers. And then comes the key point, because the humanist that I have here is really a deconstructionist, so really likes to deconstruct language. Said, but who is that we? Whom are you addressing? Is it some ideal community of science, or is it the royal we of presidents, or politicians, or editors? I doubt whether it's that simple. It seems to me that the nature of that we is to depend on the audience. It's a lecture. You probably have a spectrum of listeners like here, ranging from your collaborators, students, to your professional peers. To your student, you want to make it plain in front of everyone that you're acknowledging her contribution. But what about the big wheel up in front? You have several big wheels sitting right here. Let's just take these two, both of them members of the National Academy of Sciences. What about the big wheel up front who one day is supposed to nominate you to the National Academy? The one who's supposed to know that you're really the senior author, even though your name may be last. I bet with him that we signifies something else. Here we clearly mean, the we clearly mean, never mind the mob. You and I know that it was really my idea. And the professor said, now wait a moment, that's not fair. And she said, wait, don't take it personally. Suppose this were a real lecture audience that's here, and by we, you actually meant we. How would different listeners interpret your we? Of course, it's even more difficult in writing. You don't know the precise composition of your readership. It changes all the time. That's the wonderful thing about the we. How it's taken depends on the listener's investment in your work and your investment in their investment. Have I made myself clear? Well, that's from the novel. So you see the kind of novel it is. You learn a hell of a lot from that. And why did I really do this? Because I wanted to become an intellectual smuggler. That is really how I would introduce myself, in that I use fiction, and then later on play, to talk about topics that one really should do in an instructional, in a pedagogic, in a didactic way. But primarily to an audience that either doesn't read, and that would be true of most chemistry graduate students, not because they're ignorant, but if you ask them what's the last novel you've read, and you'll probably say, I don't know, Jane Austen or Dickens or something from high school, an obligatory course, because you're right now in a 70 or 80 hour work week. You read all the time, but you know, it's chemistry. You have no time to read the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books or God knows an entire novel. And when you have a choice of books outside, you pick the thinnest one when they give it to you and not the thickest one. And that's no insult to you because that applies everywhere. It's very unfortunate. But so I thought, at least for the rest of the audience, not this type of audience, who do read but are afraid of science or ignore it or say they do not understand it. And again, if you give them a lecture about something, they don't even come to the lecture. Is smuggle it to them and put it into a fictional context, which however is not fiction, but the real truth. And then if they've read it, if it's a novel that's interesting enough and exciting enough and well written enough, or at least that they turn the pages, they've learned something at the end. And that's true of every one of my novels and plays. And I think that's why they are probably successful, and not because it's some great literature, although I think it's good literature, but that's, you know, maybe just the self-conceit of the author. The second one is my favorite novel of the four that I've written, The Bourbaki Gambit. And could I ask very quickly, would you just tell me, those of you who have heard of the name Bourbaki, not my novel, but not if you've read my novel before? Yeah, well, you know, you can see it's sort of less than half a dozen people, and there's usually people who are very good in mathematics. because there is a Bourbaki. And I'll tell you in a moment what it is. I'd again show you the distribution of it. You see it in Japanese, in Chinese, in Italian. It won actually an important literary prize in Italy, in German, in Danish, so in everything. And it is dedicated, again, to 3 chemists and my former wife. Gilbert Stork, Koji Nakanishi, Kurt Mislow from Princeton, and my wife, Diane Middlebrooke. And they are hidden in that novel. In fact, I thought of it on the day that Kurt Mislow became emeritus at Princeton. And a lot of us were invited there for a big celebration, giving lectures. And yet I noticed there was something very unhappy about this in his mind. Then he told me what it was, and that's when I had the idea to write the Bourbaki Gambit. When I'm telling you this was the Nicolas Bourbaki, a very famous French mathematician who does not exist, and who has been publishing since the 1930s, in other words, for over 80 years. And it is a group of originally French mathematicians, since then they've elected a few others, who write on the nom de plume of Nicolas Bourbaki. And the name of that, why they chose, is also very interesting. And I've done a lot of research on the Bourbakis because it interested me. So I wrote a novel about a modern Bourbaki, namely not mathematicians, but in this case a group of molecular biologists, biochemists, biophysicists, 4 of them, who all happened to be above the age of 60, and either were forcefully retired, in Japan they would be, or in Europe, or they would be Americans, in which case they would be bribed into retirement, and while they accepted or resented. And they're still fairly bright. Of course, I was predicting how I would feel if that happened to me, and revenge themselves. Again, revenge, that theme, that powerful theme. And they decided to form a cabal and still do research on a new project, but do it under a fictitious name. And they discover PCR. So this is a novel about PCR, and was published the year before the Nobel Prize was given to PCR. I was not very surprised about it because I nominated them. I'm sure other people did also for the Nobel Prize. But I picked a very important discovery and wanted to show what would happen if an anonymous group or someone unknown de plume would do it. And would they then be satisfied? Or would they, in fact, then claim afterwards, retrospectively, I don't know, it was my idea, not the other member of our group. And that's really basically what this novel is about. I show you, I did an amusing experiment here. Namely, here's a mixture. In other words, how would it be if around Breslau, famous chemist at Columbia, Koji Nakanishi, another one there, published not under Nakanishi and Breslau, but under Brezhnishi. And you see I took half of one and half of the other. And if you look actually, but you have to divide it, then there happen to be 4 people, and you'll see on the cover of one of them has a skirt because one of the 4 is a woman, and the other one is another man. So what happens if you do this? And it's a tricky thing here. Third novel, Menachem Seed, an interesting one. Here you see the hard copy, and that's a provocative one, because if you look very carefully, what you really see is a naked man and an erect penis entering into vagina. The only reason that you can actually get this on a cover and have it in a book is that it was painted by Leonardo da Vinci and belongs to the Queen of England. So it's presumably a reasonable topic. And it was one of his famous anatomical drawings in which he wanted to write about, well, he connected the penis to the spinal cord, which of course is incorrect, but metaphorically is correct, no question whatsoever. And here I'm writing about male infertility and about ICSI. And I won't tell anything further about ICSI is because we're going to have a whole play, and you'll see an excerpt of this in just a moment. But again, it's something that's been translated in quite a number of languages. As you see here, the English, the German, it's either Japanese or Chinese. The paperback, which you have outside, the Italian one, the Spanish one, and as you see, what I really am talking about is ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection. We'll cover that later. But just so you know what I'm dealing with here. But I'm dealing about something else in this novel. And it's also a novel about the pugwash movement. And again, I suspect that the majority of you do not know what pugwash is. I belonged to pugwash for 20 years between the 1960s and 1980s. Pugwash won the Peace Nobel Prize in 1995, the year after I published this. So twice, both for the Bourbaki Gambit, and in this case, I published a novel about something that then won the Nobel Prize the following year. And it is an insider's club, you could say, of scientists created during the days of Bertrand Russell in the 1950s, during the Cold War, trying to see whether physicists, primarily physicists, also some chemists, Linus Pauling was one of them, from Russia, United States, England, Germany, and a couple of other countries, the Chinese, could meet in a neutral place and discuss topics which the diplomats could not talk. And that is what pugwash eventually did. I joined in the 1960s when they talked about other topics as well, other than just that, other than just nuclear warfare, also population problems, which is where I got involved in. And then this was a time when, for the first time in the 1970s, the Israelis and the PLO met at a time when they both denied that they ever spoke to each other, denied that they would recognize each other's existence. I was present at that, and I used that for that, because it's an extremely interesting illustration and extremely timely right now, 30 years later, because it really duplicates what, in a way, should appear happen, but has not happened. Last one is, is called NO, not no, because it's a capital O and it's nitric oxide. And here again you see the cover of the hardback, which I picked, which comes from a Greek vase from 400 BC, which is in the British Museum. If you think this is a woman watering mushrooms, you're wrong. It's a woman who waters flowering penises. And if it were only one penis, they probably wouldn't have used it, but with four, it looks like flowers, so they did accept it. Penguin, the edition, did a more daring, symbolic way of this, but it basically deals with male impotence, or basically deals with penile erection, or even more basically, it deals with nitric oxide, the causative agent of penile erection. And here again, an interesting example. When I just published that, the year after that, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was given for nitric oxide and its application in blood pressure and so on. So this was for, and I remember the LA Times writing a book review and saying, if you'd like to know next year's Nobel Prize, read Djerassi's next novel. I never wrote another science fiction novel, but it was an amusing comment. Yeah. Again, you see it in other languages, in German and Italian and Chinese and Spanish, Japanese, and so on. What I only want to say in here, and here I talk about it in the context of Silicon Valley. So here I have it in two places, at Stanford University with professors whose names are only slightly disguised, or people that are only slightly disguised who are very well known in Silicon Valley, and about the conflicts, positive and negative, if there could be positive conflict, between academia and industry in the context of biotechnology. Because I'm talking here about a biotech company that was founded on this. Because people always think that Viagra was the first drug. It was not. Viagra was the second one. And I'm really describing the invention of the first one and how it really went through the FDA and things like that, and the conflicts that may occur. But I want to quote one very important thing in here. Namely, that I would like you to read. The main character, as many others, is a woman called Renu Krishnan, who incidentally in my novel got a PhD at Stanford with Barry Sharpless, just to show you how accurate I am, and went to one of my lectures and critiqued that lecture, which you find in the novel. But becomes about it. But what I really want to talk about is the Asianization of American science. And the audience here is partly an example of this here. When I started at Stanford in 1959, I suspect that among our graduate students, our graduate students or postdocs, we had maybe 2 to 3.5% of Asian students. And Asians were, in fact, in particular, among the postdocs, almost exclusively Japanese or Indian and not Chinese, because at that time there was no connection between them. If you do it now, of course, it's completely the reverse. At Stanford altogether, there are almost 40% of all the students of Asian origin. In some departments in American universities, the vast majority graduate students are Asian and not native-born Americans. And I use it in a very positive rather than a negative context, I must like to say it. But I want to describe it. And I decided I want to describe it particularly through the role of the women from there, because they come from societies, be it China or India, just take 2 examples, could be Korea, Vietnam, Pakistan. But the important ones, numerical, are really Indian and Chinese, who come from a cultural setting in which women's role is very carefully defined and is very different from that in America. I'm not saying it's better or worse, it's different. And when they come here, and particularly when they come here as graduate students or perhaps even as college students, and Renu Krishnan came as a college student to Wellesley first, and then start shedding some of the more controlling aspects of their home culture with respect to women without accepting the new one, and sitting between 2 cultural chairs, which is a major problem in many respects in their personal life. And then, of course, also discuss the discriminatory aspects of foreigners here. On the one hand, we are very liberal. On the other hand, we are quite a racist, no question whatsoever. And that's particularly true of people of color. And I'm very blunt about this and describe this in the context of a woman character. So I think from that standpoint, again, thinking of the readership here, of the students who get a free novel, I think you might find that that one or the preceding one, the 2 more interesting ones there. And then I want to just show you that I am now getting to plays in a moment, but I'm jumping ahead because I've written 2 plays for schools and not for the theater. And by schools, I mean they are 50 minutes long. They are for high school, generally junior, senior, or colleges, and they've been used in many different schools. At Wisconsin, for instance, they use it quite often in chemistry. And that is one that that's the second one that I wrote, with Pierre Laszlo, a French chemist. And it was published in a small volume in 3 languages. So it has in it has a German text, the English text, and a French text. So that's also ideal for language instruction if you want to do it here. And it shows you how you can, I'm jumping now to dialogue and theater, how you can do it purely didactically, which you should not do in a commercial theater because people don't want to just be instructed. But here it's for schools, it's not for theater. And these are not, you don't need any staging or anything like this. This is supposed to be a dialogue. There's a very good German word for it, which is called Wortgefecht. And Wortgefecht means a verbal fight, rather than just a verbal argument. And there are no question whatsoever. In this particular case, there are actually 3 people. One who's called A, who's a male chemist, B, who's a woman biologist, biochemist, and VC, who is a venture capitalist. And they meet first in a cafe and talk about nitric oxide. And you see very quickly, for instance, the chemist says they want to collaborate on something. He said, well, first we need money, otherwise no go. And she says, I hate begging for money for research. And he says, welcome to the 21st century. Now, let's start with NO. Just a few years ago, they said, it would have been crazy, fund a collaboration with a chemist and biologist on nitric oxide. And then, you know, the chemist says, especially when most people confuse nitric with nitrous oxide and think we're interested in laughing gas. And then it says, roll their eyes when they learn nitric oxide, you know, it's poisonous, ozone layer, blah, blah, blah. And then, but now, you know, there are so many medical problems, which biological function should we pick? And the man says penile erection. And she says typical male response. And he says, well, that's hitting below the belt. And she said, you'll recover. And then he said, well, I think of grantsmanship. If you get an application, you know, to the NIH or NSF or even a private foundation and say, you know, penile erection, at least they read it. You don't know how they're going to evaluate it. Okay, and then the play goes on. And what they really talk about then is about nitric oxide. But they say they're doing it in a cafe. And the chemist said, well, you know, I need slides. And I said, do you? In a cafe. Suppose you have to tell it to a venture capitalist. Only thing you have is napkins or a paper tablecloth. And you have only that space, and you're going to have to write it there. And have to write it in language that people can understand. And that's what the play is about. And how do I end it? We end it because, remember, it's for students. We end it then with a rap. Because raps are wonderful instructional media, and they really go with students. And I'll play only the first part of the rap. So I will, yes, the mute part.
It's the N to the O, you know it don't stop. It's time to break it down in the form of hip-hop. The N is for nitric, the O is for oxide. It's got a lot of scientists riled up worldwide. It's such a hot topic, and you saw it today in A and B and VC's horseplay. And here we are, y'all, nearly at the end of it. But before we go, we want to recall all the benefits. If you take notes, you can use your pen. So once again, the key applications of NO. They made it very clear in the first section that without the NO, you would get no erection, and without the erection, there would be no humping. So that's gotta tell you NO is useful for something. Number 2. NO is healing, yes it rocks. It's a possible treatment of septic shock. Number 3. Guess who gives your body protection by somehow fighting off parasitic infections? Did you guess NO? Well then you were right. If you didn't, you were wrong. Thanks for playing. Good night. Number 4. Here's some more information. It combats cell proliferation.
Well, it goes on and on. It's quite amusing. The point I'm trying to make is that, like in any scientific paper, you summarize at the end. And here we summarize the entire thing in the form of a rap. And it's a very accurate rap. That's the interesting part. So if you teach about nitric oxide in one of your classes, you could start with a rap and just outline the many extraordinary number of applications of nitric oxide in medicine. I want to skip, we don't have enough time. I would like to know, move immediately to the theater. The basic question, usually the theater people, of course, will ask, what can science do for the theater? I ask, what can the theater do for science? And that's what I used it for. And I would like to show you very quickly now what I've written. Here's the tetralogy of science in theater plays, which I started 15 years ago. An immaculate misconception, which really the main subject is sex in an age of mechanical reproduction. Oxygen, which I've written together with Holt Hoffman. Calculus, which appeared in book form in Newton's Darkness, because there's a second play in there by a man named David Pinner that also deals with Newton. I'll tell you what it's all about. Then a non-chemical play, Ego, and I only show it to you because this is where I cannibalized the novel of Revenge, which was never published, in which I wrote to revenge my future, with respect to my future wife. Another chemical play, which is a very amusing one, Fallacy. You can see I know how to spell fallacy. So the reason why I use PH, you can see rather obvious why I do that. And then Taboos. And then finally in Chemistry and Theater, 2 plays called Insufficiency and Fallacy. And I want to point out to you that Insufficiency is dedicated to a Stanford colleague because it deals with real science. And part of it, the science of beer, is certainly one. Really, I got the scientific idea from reading one of Dick Zayer's paper on beer, and it's not bad because I don't mean paper. I take that back, Dick. But I meant it's not a bad example because what I want to illustrate in there is the question about fashion of science, and here was a serious physical chemist, Dick Zayer, and he published about beer, and most people, even though they read it, smiled or cracked and said, now you're playing with beer, what else? I mean, it's playing around, and the only reason they're taking seriously because it's so many other important things. If you only had published a beer paper, I don't think you would have had tenure here. In fact, you wouldn't be sitting here. You might be introducing me, but only because I invited you, not because they invited you. And the same situation with Gérard Léger-Belair, who has done the same thing in the champagne field and has had a hell of a time in his own institution. And that's what the play is about. Now, let's start with an immaculate misconception. That was a very important play. And that's really what got me hooked. And I was lucky because I picked really with foresight a topic which at that time had just become interesting, namely what the future of reproduction, of reproduction, human reproduction would be. And I really talk, I think it may well be for the first time that it was done in writing, because remember it was in the 1990s, the prediction that young women will eventually store their young eggs and freeze them, and then have their children later on as they postpone childbearing, and many of you will be postponing childbearing, and can use their young eggs. And then if they do so, they might as well get sterilized, because they'll have it in the bank for the couple of children they'll have, and they don't have to spend thousands of dollars on contraception, just as an example. But I particularly talk about a new technique, the most important in vitro technique, namely ICSI. Now, I'm assuming that many of you don't know what ICSI is. ICSI is an acronym. But you know, if I explain it to you, of course you'll understand. It's intracytoplasmic sperm injection, and to translate it into simple English, it's the injection of a single sperm into an egg. Whereas we men are totally inefficient. We bombard a woman with 50 or 100 million sperm, so that one miserable sperm makes it to the egg, and then we're finished. You know, we're finished. Goodbye. Then the rest happens with the woman, and most species, other than humans and a couple of others, don't even know who their children are. You know, a fish doesn't know who his son is, or a mosquito, or a snake, or something like that. So that's what the play is about. But how do you explain ICSI? And I want to show you how it's done in a theater. And you'll hear a dialogue, which is not that of actors, but of my wife and myself, because we were doing it for the film editor, who had to splice it together to fit the dialogue in my play. So what we're doing in this case here, actually showing an ICSI injection, a real ICSI injection, for which incidentally a baby will eventually be born, done right here at Stanford. And you'll see that here. So first of all, I want to show it, and that has been translated to 12 languages. The BBC World Service broadcasted, NPR is broadcasted, and in Germany, and Sweden, and Korea, and so on. So that's, and it's still being produced in many places. So that's a meaningful. It's interesting. Well, I'll skip it here. This is a Swedish one there. No. You see here the English. That's rather interesting. I want to show you how different places interpret what I show. This is an interesting one because you wouldn't expect that. That's Singapore. That came from a Singapore repertoire theater. Now, Singapore is a very conservative place. The majority of people are Chinese there. They have major problems now with respect to reproduction. Lots of women don't get married because lots of women there become professional women. So the government is now very much concerned with this here and so on. So what do they have? They have it's a really sexist one. I mean, she has superb legs, no question whatsoever. You know, relatively short. So she stands before a dispensing machine. What is a dispenser? You think it's either soft drinks or cigarettes. It's a dispenser for babies. So you see, there's a very interesting message in this whole thing. Even the elegance of the woman, the male sexist way of showing her. Okay. And then you see in a different one, the Japanese, I can't read it, but you see there the focus is on the baby diet technology. Here's an interesting one, the Portuguese were southern macho. Here the title is, this sperm belongs to me, you know, instead of talking about an immaculate misconception, which of course you can't translate to other languages, because only in English does it have two meanings, misunderstanding and then the French made a joke out of it, you know, une immaculée misconception. In other words, Miss Europe, Miss Paris, and so on here. And then used, very interesting, the famous Leonardo da Vinci drawing, but making it a woman rather than a man when you see the uterus and the baby. Well, so they all got the message. And then you see how it's produced. For instance, in the Portuguese production was in a very big theater, the Trindade, and you see there, I make the woman the inventor of ICSI, incidentally, although in actual fact it's 4 Belgians, men in 1991, Van Stuytgem and colleagues. And you see the injection of a single sperm is done under the microscope here, and usually shown on a video. Now, in this case, we made a big video, and we made it egg-shaped, doesn't make any difference. And she, the reproductive biologist who has just done the first ICSI injection, shows it to a physician, an infertility specialist, who will then do the medical application. So he's watching her. His name is Felix, and she's Melanie. And that's the dialogue that you'll hear. You see instead, yeah. Okay, so do I hit it again? And then once more. No, okay.
Here we are. Look. Just a few.
That's very infertile sperm.
Never enough to fertilize an egg on their own. But they are swimming. A good sign. Let's see whether I can catch this one. You know how thin this capillary is? 1/10 the thickness of a human hair. That's all I've got for crushing its tail so the sperm can't wiggle away. Oh my God! It's heading straight for the capillary, head first, crawling into it rather than running away.
Christ, he's in it! What now?
Well, I'll have to kick it out, start all over. Out you go. Bet you won't do that again. Gotcha.
Not bad. Not bad at all.
Now comes the tricky part. I've got to aspirate it tail first. As soon as I get close enough, just a little suction will do the trick. Ha! Gotcha!
Quit playing with him.
You sound as if this were your sperm. Isn't it strange, Felix? You call the sperm him, while I call it it. But I'm not playing with it. I just want to be sure that I can manipulate it at will. Here we are. Isn't she a beauty? Just look at her. Here you are, my precious baby. Now stand still while I arrange you a bit. Watch as I clasp her on my suction pipette. See the polar body on top? Like a little head. I want it in the 12 o'clock position. Felix, now cross your fingers, please. All of them.
What's the problem? Is it always this difficult?
No, it's one thing to do this with a hamster, but quite another to do it with this sperm into this.
My God, you did it! Beautiful penetration.
But I've got to be sure I went through the cell membrane.
You got through it all right. Now shoot him out.
Here we go. Damn you. First you jump in where you aren't wanted, and now you don't come out when you should. You've got to. Ah, that's a good boy.
You did it. Look at him. Just look at him. Sitting in there. It's amazing. That egg looks...
Okay, I'll just stop at this point here. No, we'll need it right away for the next one here. You see it sitting right here. And if a man has 1 or 2 million sperm in an ejaculate, he's infertile. So now this was, of course, the initial done for the treatment of infertility. But you know, some of the wordplay you heard, she calls the sperm it, she calls the egg, you know, her and so on here. It's really talking about power relationships, the power relationship between women and men. I learned that from my wife, who was asked by the dean here at Stanford when she had to meet with him, and I don't think it was you, Artie, you wouldn't have asked that question, but I remember there was a dean, the Cognizant Dean for Feminist Studies, that was the program was evaluated every 5 years. He was an engineer and not a humanist. He said, why do you call it feminist studies? It's so aggressive. And she said, like scientist, you know, feminist, scientist. And then said, well, how do you define that? And defined, she says, it's about power relations. Power relations between men and women in every discipline. And if you think about in sex and reproduction, in the history of mankind, men are here and women are down here. Men propose marriage, sexual intercourse, seduction, rape, whatever it is. But it's always like this. But reproductively, it's exactly the reverse. You know, we are completely unimportant, inefficient, as I told you. We contribute 1 sperm, and then 99% of the rest thing occurs with women. Well, I wanted to talk about power play, how man, you know, refer to sperm as him, whereas, you know, she more dismissively calls it it, whereas the egg, of course, is the important one. And, you know, when Dick Zare introduced me and talked about father of the pill, I, in fact, always felt, not just with respect to me, but a chemist in general, that I think the chemist in medicine is usually the mother of the invention and not the father, because nothing can happen in a medical drug until the compound is first conceived and then synthesized and made available for the biologists to do the experiments. So to me, the chemical is the egg, and the chemist is the mother. The biologist produces a sperm. The key biological experiment that fertilizes the egg produces it. So the father of the invention is a biologist, and the midwife is a physician, can be a hermaphrodite. Doesn't make a difference. But the fact of the matter is, it shows also you need at least 3 major disciplines: chemistry, biology, and medicine. Public, of course, thinks always that the medicine, whereas it has to start with chemistry, and it could be a male mother and it could be a female father in this metaphoric sense. I'm just digressing, but I want to tell you why am I digressing, because 5 plays later, I wrote another play which is talks about the social consequences of this and what has changed since that time. I wrote that play nearly 10 years later than the first one here. And that's called Taboos. And you see, incidentally, here the image, which was an interesting one, the male symbol broken. Why? Because of the single sperm injection. That, of course, really removes any of the power aspect of the male, especially since, of course, the fertilization carried out under the microscope but not in the vagina. So there's no vaginal intercourse. And if you think about it, by now there are about 5 million people in the world. I'm sure there are some sitting right here in the audience who are born without sexual intercourse. You may not know this. Your parents may not have told you that. But anyone who is an in vitro baby was born that way. And 5 million is a fair number only during the last 30 years. As far as ICSI is concerned, there are probably close to 1 million ICSI babies by now. So this is an extraordinary development which occurred very quickly. And I wanted to write about the social implications of it. And in the play Taboos, I write about 2 couples which also explain the extremes of the situation. One couple is in San Francisco and is a lesbian couple who would like to have children. And the other one is a highly religious fundamentalist, typical American religious Baptist or couple from the South, who of course do not believe in either homosexual relations or, for that matter, in vitro fertilization. And the conflicts between the two. So it's not making fun of one or the other. It's really describing this, although it is in an amusing way. And it was sufficiently successful that all these plays intended to open first in London. But the New York premiere of this play was excerpts were filmed by NPR for the Friday science show with, what's his name, Plato. In other words, so Ira Plato. So you see, this is from the NPR show, it's only 2 minutes. So you see 2 very short scenes. You see one in which a Christian, that Christian couple, the brother is the brother of one of the lesbian women. She comes from this Christian family, was kicked out. She lives in San Francisco. He's in Mississippi. He's married to a very fundamentalist wife, who, however, is infertile. And so you'll see, first of all, a meeting between the brother and sister we're talking about, and then you see one between the husband and wife, each about a minute long. Here's a Bulgarian one, which is rather interesting because here it shows, their emphasis in this case in the picture is on the lesbian aspect rather than on the reproductive aspect. And notice, very sophisticated picture. This is a Magritte, famous Magritte painting, which they're using in this case here. Okay, now, I'll take it again.
What do you think about artificial insemination?
I don't believe in artificial procreation.
Not even for a married couple?
You're not a married couple!
That wasn't my question.
Well, okay, I can see how for a married couple there might be circumstances that would excuse it in God's eyes,
So
I guess.
You're not against it in principle?
I guess not, under special circumstances.
And you don't think my relationship with Harriet is just such a circumstance?
Well, you aren't infertile, are you? If you want a baby, settle down with a decent man.
Oh, I don't want a man. I never have, and I never will.
Take care.
That was her.
Yeah.
You're going to see her again?
Yeah.
Because I've forgiven you. That was for the last visit. You can't forgive ahead of time.
I've got to see her.
When?
In September.
Why then?
It'll have been 9 months.
You mean she's having a baby? Oh, Lord. Here's your faithful servant wanting a child more than anything else, and she ends up pregnant. How?
What do you mean, how?
Who is the father? An anonymous sperm donor?
No, it's Max.
Who's Max? Oh, good grief! Max!
Yeah, I know. Priscilla didn't fornicate with him. That's not how she got pregnant.
How did you know that?
Because I was there.
Okay, I won't play the whole thing because we are running out of time, and I'd like to show you about a couple of other things. Okay, third play, calculus. You're not going to learn about the calculus in the play, although it is about calculus, but it is about the toughest priority struggle, probably the worst one in the history of science, between Newton and Leibniz, the two giants of the late 18th and early 18th century and late 17th century, about a scandal that very few people know about. And the basic theme of the play is not who invented calculus, which is what the struggle was, who is the inventor of the calculus, but can you be a shit and a great scientist? And that is not a funny question. That's a very serious question, because the answer is yes. And in the case of Newton, you talk probably about one of the greatest shits that existed in that era, from every standpoint, cruel and vindictive and everything else, and yet clearly one of the greatest scientists who ever lived. And I'll show you a very brief scene. What happened, I'm particularly interested in doing this in front of someone who's sitting there, who was a student of mine and helps me in the research of that play. I had two students from my class who actually were research assistants for that. And that is, so Toniana, you're not permitted to say anything. You can only listen to it. Yeah. What I want to do is, what did Newton do? Newton was not only the greatest scientist at that time, he was the most powerful one. He was president of the Royal Society. And Leibniz, the German, was a foreign member of the Royal Society. And he, the president, appointed an anonymous committee of 11 fellows of the Royal Society to judge the case, to be both witness, jury, and judge. And I wanted to really ask the question, how can 11 important scientists be willing to be so manipulated by the powerful man? Because that's a dangerous thing. You behave badly. That is why it's so dangerous to be able it's possible to be a shit and a great scientist. Because you're an example then to other people who see, yes, you can get away with that. So I want to do it through the eyes of that committee. And since 11 is too many, I picked 3 of them. And I picked 3 of the most unusual ones. And one of them is Dr. Arbuthnot. Incidentally, that anonymous committee was only, the names were only discovered 100 years later in the middle 19th century. Until then, it was an anonymous committee, and that has all been published. It's all in the records of their report. And that Dr. Arbuthnot is a very unusual man because he was a physician. He was also a bit of a mathematician. He was the man who coined the word John Bull. He actually was also a writer, really a polymath. And you see a very brief scene between Dr. Arbuthnot, a Scot, at the Royal Society, and Newton. I'll tell you nothing else about this. You'll see this very brief scene, and you see how in a theater, in this case of the case history, you can demonstrate, it's really, these are wonderful actors, through gestures and so on, the power relationship between these people and how and why they were allowed to be manipulated. And it's a very important example, in my opinion, in terms of ethics. It's a play within a play, incidentally, as you'll see here.
London, 1712. The following day, Mr. Newton waits in the shadows of an antechamber at the Royal Society. Dr. Arbuthnot enters carrying the report. Mr. Newton gestures for him to sit down. Sir Isaac, I deduce that not a word is to be altered in this report. And thus it is to be published unamended. Even if some members demur? I see, yes, of course. Such protest would be apostasy in your eyes. Unacceptable to the President of the Royal Society.
Second, inventors have no rights. Dr. Arba. Not. None.
No, indeed, none whatsoever. But for myself, Sir Isaac, and I speak solely for myself, I hold open disputes in disdain.
But so do I, Dr. Arba. Not. No open disputes.
In that case, may I make a proposal, Sir Isaac? What is needed here is a unanimous published report.
Unanimous. All 11.
Naturally.
Again, I'll stop because we have to move on. But I want to tell you what very few people know, but that's a historical fact, is that Newton himself wrote the report and gave it to the 11 people and said, that is your report that you are going to submit. Just imagine if the president of the Royal Society nowadays would do this. Every newspaper would have it, that president would be kicked out of the Royal Society and everything else. So that is the story. And it's an interesting one. And of course, one of the books outside you can pick is this particular play. I'm going to get very quickly to the next thing. I'll skip. It was interesting, converted into an opera, which was wonderful. And the Zurich Opera played this 5 times in 2005, the year of physics. But I don't think we have time. I wanted to play that for you, but we'll skip this here. I want to quickly go to the play Oxygen that Professor Zea mentioned, which Rolf Hoffman and I wrote together. And I want to tell you, while it is about oxygen and who discovered oxygen, the real theme in there, just like in the case of calculus, was can you be a shit in a scientist? In this case, what does discovery mean in science? We really have not defined that. Interestingly enough, the Nobel Prize has never been managed to define it, and therefore that is why you have frequently multiple winners. Is it the person who did something first, the discovery of the invention, who published it first? Because if it doesn't get published, it's really unknown, or the one who really understood it first. And frequently have all three. In the case of oxygen, that's a dramatic example where you have that. Because the first one, without question, is the person you know least, namely Carl Wilhelm Scheele, a Swedish pharmacist, who without question did it first. Joseph Priestley, who without question published first, and Lavoisier, who without question was the only one who understood it, who deserves this prize. So we have it in there. Well, it's a play that has now been translated into 20 languages. The most recent one, the preceding one was Catalan, and this week I got the Danish book. They've been published in book form. There are very few plays that get translated to 20 languages. And I want to show you what is so fantastic about the theater, which I incidentally teaches in my seminar. The seminar I teach at Stanford is called Science in Theater. And that people don't usually consider in the theater and talk in favor of the film, which of course is much more popular. When you have a fantastic film and you show it all over the world, it's always exactly the same film. The only thing that's changed is either the subtitles or the dubbing, but it's even the same language. You can change nothing after that. In a play, no play is ever finished. Not even that of dead people, but particularly not of living ones. And you can change it for the milieu, for the cultural situation, for the audience. And it's an interaction, it's a collaboration, rather like scientific collaboration, that when you're finished with the play, the author, it only starts, because then you deal with the dramaturg, with the director, and of course with the actors. And I want to show you here, I'll show you two two-minute things. I'll show you a scene from the American production so you know what is going on. And I'll show you exactly the same scene from the Bulgarian one, which was a very extreme one. I could have shown you also the Korean. In Korea, it was a smashing success. There were over 20,000 people who saw it over a period of 2 years, and it was played all over the country in the context of science festivals and so on. So let me show you. But I'll show you very, just 1 second. I'll show you very quickly. So the translation in book form. So you see here the Chinese version, for instance, on the left, the Korean version. These are actually the books about it here. You see here the French one, the Brazilian one, the Spanish one, the Italian one, and there's even a DVD which an instructional place sells here in the United States of this here. Now, here. This is the American production, American production.
You will meet them both?
His Majesty insisted.
That's Lavoisier and his
dinner in
wife.
Paris with Priestley. I worry.
So do I. There were witnesses.
And the letter?
What letter?
Shayla's. I saw it.
You saw it?
It's complicated, but I couldn't tell you.
Then why do it now?
I feel guilty.
And I must share your guilt?
You are my husband.
Where is the letter?
Hidden.
You have not destroyed it.
You look so angry. Why?
I do not wish to discuss it.
You cannot tell your wife.
No, I can tell no one.
But why?
Once voiced, I'd have to deny that thought or condemn it.
So you disapprove of what I did?
You're still young.
Why blame you?
Subtlety only comes with maturity.
Now it's a Bulgarian. Same thing. Just wait till you see how it ends.
Научи ме сега на коварство.
Ако знаех, че за да заяви първенството си Шели е избрал частно писмо, а не научна статия, щях да искам това писмо да изчезне.
Точно за това.
Но нямаше да искам да знам, че е изчезнало.
Ако това е коварство, аз не го разбирам.
You know, she says, I do not understand, Nonagenarian. And now no more words. And remember, it's the idea she's his wife, did it out of love, hitting the letter, and you'll see how he expresses that, the mixture of relationships that suddenly develops. So the same play, the same scene, produced, written by the same people, and you see the very enormous difference. The next play, I don't have time to describe it because you'll be able to see it in 1 week. It's about insufficiency, dedicated in part to Professor Zehr. But the main topic is how not to get tenure in a chemistry department. So that's very relevant. And it is through some real science. And the two topics I'm talking about, tenure and fashion in science. And the two things are related. Because if you do some very good work in a very non-fashionable thing, you may get tenure, but you run a real risk. And I want to show you that even though the premiere was only in London last year, it has been done as dramatic readings in quite a number of institutions. And I give an example. The first one actually was done at Caltech, at Cambridge, at a UChem conference in Europe, at my alma mater, both Kenyon College and Wisconsin, and Germany and Berlin and Dortmund and Bielefeld, UC Santa Cruz and so on. The Bulgarian one was extremely interesting. I was there in May. My son was there with me. I was giving the commencement address for an American university there, and they performed it in both English and Bulgarian, and then in Cologne. And here, I'll just show you very quickly, to tempt you to come to the play, because it is on Saturday, February 8th at Cabaret, and it's free. And Cabaret is big, so there's room for lots of people. And you can see what it is. There's only a very brief scene from it. This is the announcement for the Cabaret. It's at 8 o'clock on Cabaret, February 8th. Now, you see the man talking to the chairman of the department, the man who's up for tenure.
The departmental recommendations should be unanimous.
This is now a rule?
It's not exactly a rule, it's a guideline, but a strong one.
Why?
We shouldn't give the dean excuses not to forward it to the provost.
And you want Professor to make exception?
Yes, there are always exceptions. But your case wouldn't be one.
Because I'm not a woman? Or physically disabled? Or not a minority? Leo, I have been a minority of one since the day I joined this department. The only foreigner who joined this third-rate university, who accepted an associate professorship at age 39 when I had more experience than half the tenured faculty in this lousy department.
Now wait a minute.
No, I have not finished yet, because you and the provost have showed me it would be a matter of time and I'll be put up for tenure. So,
please, pull yourself together.
So, what was the vote?
What's the difference? It's unanimity that counts.
What was the vote?
17 to 3.
There are 24 faculty members in this department.
The rest abstained.
Oh, cowards. In that case, 17 represents 85% of those voting. That's not too bad.
Sit down.
I don't want to sit down. I want to know whether you were for my recommendation, even though it was not unanimous.
I can't.
What do you mean you can't?
It was 17 against.
Okay. I can't talk about this, which I'd love to. It came from a course that I taught here, ethical discourse in science and fiction, in which, in our biomedical curriculum, which I wanted to teach here in chemistry. And I have to say, our then chairman did not want, that was not either one of the two of you, did not want me to do it in chemistry, so I went to the medical school. It was done in medicine, medical school. It was probably the most exciting course I taught in 50 years at Stanford. And it was graduate students and postdocs, and it was who came from all the biomedical disciplines, chemistry, biophysics, even computer science and so on. And I asked them, each has to write a short story in the semester before, because they knew when they would take it with me, in which they would write a short story of 10 pages or less, in which they describe an ethical dilemma which they experienced, thought about, and so on. In other words, they pick it, not I. They send it to me by email, I comment on it, and then I remove it. So no one knows who wrote what. And then we had 3-hour discussions on each of them. And these were fireworks, because people were able to, particularly women, it was roughly half men, half women, were willing to address topics that they were not willing to do otherwise. But here was no one knew who wrote what, and no one tried to find out who wrote what. And it was so excellent that I eventually decided, and here's this Renga experiment, to say, you were so good, during the course, let's write a Renga short story, the Japanese style, so that everyone writes a paragraph, but no one knows who wrote the preceding paragraph except for me. So I would send it to the first student, and you have 2 days to write the paragraph and send it to me. So the most powerful ones are number 1, number 2, number 14 students altogether. 1, he or she starts the story. The second one could still kill them all off or continue the story. And once you continue the story, then it has a momentum. And then 14, of course, comes up at the end. It was such a good story, and it was such a good ethical example that I decided it's going to get published. I'll submit it to the toughest journal that you have. And I thought of 2, the New England Journal of Medicine or Nature. Each of them reject 90% of it. I still remember 2 chemistry students, women, graduate students, who took the course. So there were only 2 chemists out of 14, because a number of the other professors discouraged them from taking them and said, listen, you're going to take some Mickey Mouse course of Djerassi's where you just write a short story, you could work in a lab instead. Well, it turned out that Nature accepted this. And they all had a Nature publication. And I just want to show it to you here. So here it's called the Science Renga, Nature, and you ought to look at that Nature article 1998, because it's really quite brilliant what each person wrote. And then you see all the authors. And then the question comes, a very interesting question. What's the order of authors? That's another problem. You got 14 authors. They're all equal in this case here. There's no senior author. And yet everyone contributed equally. The ideal Well, how do you solve that problem? Well, that's a difficult solution. And I asked them, what do you people suggest? And some of them said, well, Professor Djerassi, you should be a senior author. It was your idea. You put it together, you organized it, and then you got it published. Well, I said, that's exactly what the course is about. I didn't do anything. I only did the organizational thing. Typical professor. No, that's not it. Well, the second one, let's toss a coin. Well, that's a possibility. Third one, do it alphabetical. Alphabetical is fair enough, but it's unfortunate. There was one person who had a B. The name started Borosevsky or something like that. Well, then, of course, luckily, that'll be the first author, and with 14 authors in Nature, in the index, it'll always say Borosevsky et al. And et al. So I said, let me handle this. And of course, the students were prepared to do it. And when you see this paper, you'll see there's a 15th author who starts with an A. And that A is an anagram. And it's an anagram that only people at Stanford would understand. And I will not give you the answer, because if you're curious enough, go look at Nature and then try and solve the problem. But I want to tell you that NPR actually invited me to talk about this, because that was really the first piece of fiction that Nature deliberately published. They published some others that were not deliberate yet. And I described it on the radio. And then I told them a story of this. And I said, there's an acronym for the name. I said, the name, an anagram, what the name is. And I said, any listener who can figure that out and send me an email, and I gave them the email address over the radio, will get a gift from me, an inscribed book. Before I got home, I already had an answer, so it was quite impressive here. Okay, I'm now 3 minutes left. This is the best book I've ever written, but I have no time to talk to you about this. It has nothing to do, because nothing to do with science. It deals with 4 people who are, some of the greatest intellectuals in Central Europe of last year. Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Scholem, and Schoenberg, a composer. But there's also some wonderful illustrations, and there's a great deal about Paul Klee in there as well. But I then decided, and now I'm finished, that I would write a play about them. Because the experiment that I did in 4 Jews on Parnassus is I did research, 3 years of research, in the archives of these people, the tremendous archives in Berlin, in Frankfurt, in Jerusalem, and in Vienna. And I was particularly interested in a subject that, if you look at Benjamin on Google, you get 2.4 million entries. If you look for his wife, Dora Sophie Benjamin, you get 1 or 2. And I was interested in the wives of these 4 people, because they all were intellectual, well-educated wives. Adorno's wife had a PhD in chemistry, just to give you an example. So I want to write about the wives, and that was one of the chapters in there, and it actually was broadcast as a radio play. But I wrote it all in dialogic form, as if it were a play, but it isn't a play. It's just called 4 Jews on Parnassus. They all are Jewish. Parnassus, the place, the mythical place up there, if you are really canonized. And they have posthumous conversations after their death about subjects they couldn't discuss before, and particularly with their wives. And then I decided I'm going to convert this into a play. And since the play is outside as one of the books, and probably no one would pick it under ordinary circumstances, after what I'll read to you, and it'll take exactly 1.5 minutes, I suspect that everyone will go up there now and try and pick it. Why? Well, there's a very interesting thing. The play has not been performed yet. The play will have its premiere in London in May. There'll be 30 performances in May. But it's a play that always appeared in book form in 3 books, that is 3 forms, in English, in German, and in Spanish. How is that possible, that a play that's never been performed already came out of the book? I submitted it to 3 publishers, literary academic publishers, not theater publishers. They have no rights to the theater. I submitted them as books, because I'm a great believer that certain plays, and the plays that I write certainly fall into that category, are very good reading. And you should try and read sometimes something that is purely dialogic and see how much enjoyment one gets out of it. So I'll read you a short portion of how the play starts, a couple of excerpts from the first scene. And they are simply a dialogue between Theodor Adorno, this world-famous sociologist, philosopher, a musicologist from Frankfurt, and his wife Gretel, who I told you had a PhD in chemistry. And it is known that he dictated to her his dreams, because he felt that dreams have a real, give you psychological insight in the person, and that he then would publish them, and they actually came out. Now, the dream that he described, I made up completely. So I tell you right away, what is only true is that he dictated dreams. But there's one word in the dreams that I won't tell you right now, which I did not invent because I didn't have that much imagination. And that comes from one of his own dreams. And so this is a dialogue between them. Teddy, all right, take this down. I dreamt that I'd gone to a bordello, fancy one, red damask, plush sofas, chandeliers, deep carpet, rather Parisian, which is strange considering how seldom I was in Paris. You in Paris or Parisian bordellos? Gretel stopped Tibet saying, we'll deal with such details when you've tapped it all up. And then imagine what she did, she the madame. Shoved a piece of paper in my direction and asked me to fill it out. It was a questionnaire with the most amazing questions, personal ones. The last book I'd read, my favorite film, whether I played any musical instruments, did I prefer skiing or tennis over skiing, whether I snored. I stopped reading and asked whether she was joking. No, she said, every new client has to fill these out. And then she asked something which I'm skipping here, and that's it. Okay, but to continue. I told her I considered such a question preposterous, considering why I'd come. Remember, the whorehouse, a bordello. Irrelevant, she replied. Before I can select a partner, we need to know whether you meet our standards. What standards, I asked? Every kind, she replied. Aesthetic, dialectic, hermeneutic, psychoanalytic, linguistic, and of course, hygienic. And you know, this dialectic, hermeneutic, psychoanalytic, linguistic are all components of Adorno's writings. He's very famous for that, so that's quite relevant. I was so taken aback that I start with the last. What hygienic standards? Whether I brush my teeth or take a daily bath? That's when she really floored me. We take her for granted, including regular use of a bidet. Then his wife says, but you've never used a bidet. And she said, so neither do most of the other people. And then she said, he continued, so the woman said, surely you know what is a bidet? She asked after making a disapproving scratch with her pen on the questionnaire when she learned that he didn't use a bidet. Before I could even tell her not to raise such idiotic questions, she proceeded to lecture me. A bidet is used to wash one's genitalia and anus, including inner buttocks, although occasionally people also wash their feet and even babies in it, but never confuse it with a urinal. Never. Stupid asshole, he said. Great. Now, Teddy, you wouldn't want such language in your book. If you keep interrupting, I'll forget the rest of the dream. Simply won't believe what she said next. Do you own a penis washing machine? If not, then I recommend the model our girls prefer. Otherwise, our rates for fellatio are tripled. By that time, his wife, of course, is about to crack up. It was so funny. And then he said, now will you read it back to me? And Gretel said, I can't. Well, you're going to see why not. Thank you very much.